Hey all, this is the video lecture for class for Psych 483 because we are not meeting physically together in class today. So we are starting the research method material. So to start us off, what I'll do is sort of go through the lecture as I normally would. It's a little bit weird because it's a video lecture, so where I say, pause and try this thing, I recommend you actually pause the video, do the thing, and push play to resume with the rest of it. Of course, you don't have to, that's up to you, but I do recommend doing that so you can get the most out of today's video lecture. So to start us off, we have been talking about social psychology as a general discipline. We've talked about having successful class discussions. So what we're going to be talking about today are research methods within social psychology, which you've probably had at least some introduction to in Psych 288. But we are going to talk specifically about some really important issues for successful research and some things that are of particular interest for our discussion for the week, which is the replication crisis in psychology. So what I'd like you to start out by doing is think about some psychological question you have. For instance, do taller people make more money than shorter people? Why are people attracted to jerks rather than nice guys? Will graduate school increase my lifetime earnings versus a bachelor's degree only? What is the average tip on an Uber ride to see if maybe you're paying too much or too little when you tip your Uber driver? By the way, if you didn't know this, Uber just made it possible very recently to tip your driver in the app. So if you haven't been previously tipping your driver, now you really have no excuse not to do that. So take a moment, write down a research question for psychology that you have. Within any sort of research, whether this is social psychological or social science more broadly or other types of science, there are three broad study designs. We have the observational method, which is all about describing things. We have the correlational method, which is all about predicting things. And we have the experimental method, which is all about what causes what. So if you haven't already, take your psychological question and I want you to rephrase it into a hypothesis, a testable, statable, disprovable statement of what you expect to find, and identify your hypothesis as primarily observational, primarily correlational, or primarily experimental. In other words, are you talking about how many or how often or how much something happens? If so, that's probably a descriptive research question. Are you looking at the relationship between two pre-existing variables? That's probably prediction. Or are you looking at the causal relationship between things? That's probably the experimental method. So let's start out by thinking about a research study as it was reported in the mass media. This is this was an article that I found relatively recently that's called "Watching Too Much TV Can Kill You!" exclamation point, capital letters. So here are two excerpts from that report from the UK Daily Mail. Sitting in front of the TV for an average 5 or more hours a day leads to twice the risk of fatal pulmonary embolism, blood clots to the lungs, as watching under 2.5 hours a day. The study found that people who watch television for more than 5 hours a day more than double the risk of fatal pulmonary embolism. The risk is even higher between people aged 40 and 59. Okay, so what I want you to do is think about this research scenario that you were just given. I want you to see if you can come up with a hypothesis that you think the researchers had. Think about how you're going to phrase it. Are you going to phrase it in an observational way? Are you going to phrase it in a correlational way? Are you going to phrase it in an experimental way? So let's talk in a little bit of detail, not very much, about these different kinds of research. Again, I recognize that you probably have had them already, so we'll run through pretty quickly. Observational research is all about the nature of the phenomenon. How many does this happen? How often do people help or fail to help when someone's in need? How many, how often, how much? That's all observational research. If we're saying only how much TV do people watch, that would be observational. If I'm saying only what percentage of deaths are due to pulmonary embolism, that would be observational. Right, so I'm not relating it to anything else. I'm not talking about multiple variables. I'm only talking about one variable, amount of TV, or one variable, percentage of deaths due to pulmonary embolism, right? So those are very straightforward questions. Think about how you could test this. So you could do, let's say, how much TV do people watch? You could do a self-report questionnaire. You could do observational data, right? Hook something up to people's TV and see how much it's on every day. You could do archival analysis using Nielsen TV data. So there are a lot of different possibilities. Let's say we're going to look at deaths due to pulmonary embolism. You're probably going to do archival analysis, right? Go out and look at the medical databases and see what percentage of deaths are due to this cause and not something else. So there are a lot of different ways we can collect data within observational research. We can do behavioral observation, right? Watching people, archival analysis, look at existing databases. We can do surveys, right? So there are a lot of different possibilities here. Observational research is relatively easy to do, but it has downsides. Sometimes it's not real interesting. Like, okay, people watch 3 hours a day on average. So what? I'm not relating it to anything else. All I'm doing is describing. So it might not be real interesting. There are also issues with private behaviors. What if people don't want you to hook up a connector to their TV to see how much they watch, right? So if we're looking at sexual behavior or toileting behavior or anything like that, like, we are going to be very limited in the observational research that we're going to be able to do. So our second kind of research, our second research design is correlational. In correlational research, the question is, how do these things relate to each other? I'm going to predict your score on X, your score on Y, knowing your score on X. But I'm not making any statement about causality. I'm not stating it explicitly. I'm not making an implicit assumption of causality. All I'm saying is that this thing is related to this other thing. They might cause each other, they might not, I don't know. All I know is that they're related. For instance, do people who watch a lot of TV tend to have more pulmonary embolisms than people who watch less TV? I'm not saying anything about causality, I'm saying tendency. Maybe people who have a heart condition both sit around at home a lot because they can't be highly physically active, and they're at higher risk for pulmonary embolisms, right? I'm not saying anything about causality. All I'm doing is saying there are two pre-existing variables out there, TV watching, pulmonary embolisms. I'll collect data on both, and I'll see how they relate. We could test this in a lot of different ways, right? We could use some of the data collection techniques we did before. The only difference with the observational research, the only difference is that now we're going to relate variables to each other. I'm not looking at one variable in isolation. That's the basic gist. The third possibility for research is experimental research. 3 criteria for a true experiment. Again, I'm going through this really quickly because I assume that you've already been introduced to this in your previous psych classes. First criterion, random assignment. People walk in the door, researcher flips a coin. If it's a heads, they are in the watch a lot of TV group. If it's tails, they're in the don't watch a lot of TV group. The only reason why somebody would be in group A or group B is because of random chance. So we're not going to let people choose which group they're going to be in, or else the groups will be unequal, and any results we might get are basically crap. Second criterion for a true experiment, the researcher manipulates something and measures something else. The terms that we give to those variables are called the independent variable, which is the thing the researcher manipulates, and the dependent variable being the thing that the researcher is only measuring. So if I flip a coin, I put you into lots of TV or not so much TV, that's my independent variable. I'm controlling that thing. I'm making you be in group A or group B. On the other hand, I'm going to measure your likelihood of pulmonary embolism. That's a dependent variable because it depends on how much TV you watch, the independent variable. The third criterion for a true experiment is a control of confounds. Confounds are all those other things that could be different across the groups besides the thing that I care about, amount of time people spend in front of the TV. So if we think about what are some possible confounds for that study. So I encourage you to pause the video for a second, think through, see if you can come up with a list of possible confounds that we have to watch out for. Some possibilities for such confounds might include the TV programs that people are watching. Maybe when people are vegging out in front of the TV for 5 hours a day, they're watching a lot of middle of the day TV, right? So they're watching some talk shows, they're watching soap operas and things like that. Whereas maybe people who are watching only 2 hours a day are watching primetime drama shows rather than those middle of the day shows. That's a confound, right? Because maybe rather than it being the amount of time that people are spending in front of the TV, maybe it's the kind of TV that they're watching, or maybe it's the time of day that they're doing the TV watching. So if we're going to be really careful about creating an experiment, we have to control not only how much TV, but also what time of day, what the program is, how exciting the program is, what else they're doing while they're watching, and so on and so forth. Those are all confounds we have to take into account. We also need to think about ethics, right? So imagine, as the person who wrote that newspaper article claims, watching too much TV can kill you. It's probably unethical to force people to watch a whole bunch of TV if we think it's going to kill them, right? Like, that's not okay. So we have to think about the ethics here. If we think it really will kill people to watch 5 hours a day, we can't randomly assign them to do that. So what do we do instead? Well, we could take a bunch of TV viewers who already watch 5 hours a day. We take half of them, we randomly assign half of them to watch only 2 hours a day. There might still be ethics involved, like, is it unethical to make people watch less TV when they really want to watch a bunch? I don't know. That's for the IRB to discuss. But that at least would be more ethical, right? We're taking people who are already at risk for pulmonary embolism, we're potentially reducing their risk. So alongside these methodological issues, we really have to consider ethical issues. And that's something that we're going to revisit later on in the semester when we get to talking about Milgram's obedience studies.